There is a particular quality of silence that exists only in certain dining rooms, the kind where the silverware costs more than most people's monthly rent, where the chandeliers cast shadows that seem to know what you're thinking before you do. The Whitmore Club in Greenwich sits on 40 acres of manicured Connecticut landscape, all rolling greens and old money discretion. The dining room is all dark wood paneling and gilt mirrors, the kind of place where a woman's jewelry is assessed before her words are heard. I had been assessed many times in that room, always found wanting. My mother wore her pearls that evening, the 3-strand Tahitian ones that required the kind of provenance document most people associate with national security. She adjusted them slightly as I sat down, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as the opening move in a carefully choreographed production. My father was already there, his face arranged in that expression of benevolent disappointment he'd perfected over 3 decades of managing people he deemed beneath him. Claire sat to my right, positioned like a supporting actress who'd somehow stolen the main role. She smiled at me with teeth and no eyes, and I noticed her phone positioned just slightly too openly on the table's edge, angled for capture. No one had told me this was an intervention, but I'd known since the car service picked me up. My father began, because he always did. He had the kind of voice that made rooms smaller, not louder, just more concentrated, like the air itself had been pressurized and redistributed according to his specifications. He spoke about my future, with the careful enunciation of someone reading a script that mattered very much. The tone was gentle, which was worse. Gentleness was the family's most effective weapon. It made cruelty look like obligation. "We care about you," he said, and meant, "Your failure is a liability to our brand." "We want to help," my mother added, and meant, "We found a way to remove the problem." The main course arrived with theatrical timing, a small beef fillet that cost more than a good laptop. I cut it into precise pieces and ate methodically. I had learned long ago that hunger was a luxury that only people who didn't need to survive could afford. I couldn't afford to show weakness. I couldn't afford much of anything, actually, which was perhaps the whole point of this dinner. Claire produced a first-class ticket. Just one. Boston to San Francisco. A fresh start, they called it. A chance to begin again. The language was careful. Not exile, never exile. Just opportunity, reframed. My father slid a check across the table. It was small enough to be insulting and large enough to be tracked. He'd calculated this precisely. He calculated everything precisely. That was where the money came from. "For your living expenses while you find yourself," my mother said, and the phrase landed with all the weight of a dismissal. I didn't argue. I'd learned that resistance only prolonged these scenes. Compliance, quick, graceful, unremarkable compliance, was the key to moving through moments like this with minimal damage. So I picked up the ticket and looked at it as though seeing it for the first time, as though I hadn't already known my departure date for 3 weeks. That's when Claire moved, just slightly. The angle of her phone shifted. She'd been recording. Of course she had. She needed documentation of my capitulation, proof of family dominance to post in those careful spaces where image was currency. I looked directly at the camera angle and let my face remain empty. Blank. A face that would translate badly to social media, too controlled to read. Claire's smile faltered very slightly. She'd been expecting tears, probably. She'd been expecting me to break. I folded the ticket carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket. "Thank you," I said, and somehow made those 2 words mean nothing at all. There is a quality to being systematically made invisible that trains you in the architecture of observation. I've been invisible since childhood. Not the invisibility of neglect, but something more precise. I was visible in specific ways, visible as a counterpoint to my sister's radiance, visible as evidence of my parents' generosity, visible as a problem to be managed. But my actual self, my thoughts, my ambitions, my worth, these things existed in the spaces between the things people noticed about me. I learned to live there. When I was 8, I won a regional mathematics competition, the kind of thing that would normally warrant family celebration. My father was attending a golf tournament that weekend. My mother had already committed to a charity gala. Claire had a recital. The competition fell into the spaces between their lives, and I went with the babysitter, placed a medal around my own neck with her help, and never mentioned it. By the time I told my parents, it was old news. They had moved on. They would always move on. In high school, I became adept at translating my own achievements into language they could understand. I didn't talk about my passion for systems and data. I talked about college applications. I didn't show them my coding projects. I showed them acceptance letters. And even then, I could feel their attention drifting, their eyes calculating social hierarchies instead of academic ones. My college choice mattered only insofar as it reflected on them. MIT was acceptable because it was prestigious. It wasn't acceptable because I was obsessed with it, because I had spent 3 years learning everything I could about their biocomputational program, because I had already designed 2 theoretical diagnostic systems that I kept in a password-protected folder on a laptop they would never ask to see. Claire, meanwhile, was perfect. Not perfect in the way I was perfect, measured, controlled, strategic. She was naturally perfect, or so the narrative went. Everything came easily to her. Everything was performed beautifully. She had the kind of confidence that comes from never being doubted, and she wielded it like a person wielding a weapon they don't realize they're holding. She wasn't cruel to me in ways that warranted intervention. She was just careless. She left a trail of small devastations in her wake, and my parents cleaned up after her, while simultaneously congratulating her for it. When I was 16 and she was 19, we were both accepted to elite universities, Columbia for her, MIT for me. My mother asked why I wanted to go somewhere so technical when Columbia had a wonderful general education program. My father mentioned that Claire's school had better networking connections. The implication was clear. I was choosing a path that didn't matter, because I was the kind of person who didn't matter. I was choosing capability over status. I was choosing reality over appearance. I went to MIT anyway. There, in those fluorescent-lit corridors and sleep-deprived labs, surrounded by people who cared about what things actually did rather than what they looked like, I began to become someone. The shell my family had constructed around me cracked slightly. For the first time, my intelligence wasn't a liability. My focus wasn't a character flaw. My refusal to perform was read as honesty rather than coldness. I spent my freshman year absorbing everything. Not just the curriculum, but the culture of that place. I learned that real problems were solvable if you were willing to be precise about them. I learned that the messy complexity of the world could be reduced to datasets and algorithms, if you looked hard enough. I learned that power came not from persuasion, but from having something people needed. By my junior year, I had become obsessed with medical diagnostics. Not the kind that existed, but the kind that could exist. I had seen my grandfather die of pancreatic cancer that wasn't diagnosed until it was stage 4, a failure of current detection methods, not a failure of medicine. I had watched my family treat his death as a tragedy that befell them, rather than a man who had suffered and died unnecessarily. They mourned the idea of it. I couldn't stop thinking about the preventable nature of it. I started building models in my spare time, systems that could integrate existing diagnostic data, apply machine learning to pattern recognition, and identify cancerous mutations years before they would become symptomatic. It was theoretical work. It was elegant work. And it was utterly disconnected from my actual life, which was increasingly a performance of acceptable mediocrity. My parents wanted me home for holidays. They wanted me to network with the right people. They wanted me to have internships that would reflect well on the family brand. They did not want me to talk about computational biology in the kind of way that made clear I was thinking about it obsessively. So I didn't. I learned to compartmentalize. I learned to have conversations with my family that sounded like conversations, but were actually sophisticated acts of omission. By the time I graduated, summa cum laude, which they barely acknowledged because Cornell had some ranking thing happening that same week, I had already decided what I was going to do. I was going to build the system. I was going to get it right. And I was going to do it in a way that required nothing from my family at all. Starting a company when your family believes you're incompetent has certain advantages. No one is watching. No one has expectations. No one is disappointed when things go wrong because nothing was expected to go right. I worked 3 jobs to fund the first year. I rented a studio apartment in Boston that smelled like the previous tenant's cooking and had a heating system that worked according to principles no engineer could explain. I wrote code until my fingers hurt, then wrote code some more. The first prototype was crude, the second was better. The third was actually functional, and I ran it against archived cases from Massachusetts General Hospital, with permission, because I was not a criminal, because I did everything right, because I understood that legitimacy was the only power structure that couldn't be disrupted by money or connections. The system worked 78% of the time. This was not good enough. I had exactly 1 investor meeting during year 1. A technical founder who had stumbled into AI and made money the way people make money, which is to say, by being in the right place when other people made mistakes. He looked at my code and told me it was conceptually sound, but probably too narrow to be venture scale. He told me I needed to think bigger. Everyone always told me I needed to think bigger. Which was interesting because he hadn't asked me about my vision, my timeline, or my actual strategy. He just looked at the current iteration and decided it was too limited. I took the feedback and rebuilt everything. It took me another year. I was 22, and I was moving on instinct and data in equal measure. Instinct about what the system needed to do, data about whether it was actually doing it. I filed every provisional patent myself, writing the language so clearly that even a patent examiner without domain knowledge would understand it. I documented everything. Dates, times, decision matrices, the names of people I consulted, the specific feedback that led to specific changes. I was building not just a company, but an archived truth. I was creating a record that couldn't be rewritten. Then the catastrophe. It came during a live pilot test with a teaching hospital in Rhode Island. We had permission, proper ethics approvals, proper insurance. We were taking patient data that had already been collected and analyzing it with our system, comparing our diagnostic suggestions against the clinical outcomes that had already been documented. It was clean. It was careful. It was controlled. And we were wrong. The system flagged 97 patients as being at high risk for liver damage based on blood panel data. Of those 97, 6 actually had documented liver damage. 91 did not. The false positive rate was catastrophic. It meant the system was essentially useless. It meant I had just wasted 2 years and considerable institutional credibility on something that didn't work. I remember the night I discovered the error. I was in my apartment, the one that smelled like other people's lives. I was running my analysis for the 7th time because I couldn't believe the first 6. The data was very clear. The system was very wrong. I sat on my bed, this thin, saggy thing that belonged to someone else before it belonged to me, and I felt something. Not grief, not exactly. Something closer to clarity. This was the point where most people would call their investors and explain the setback. This was the point where most people would ask for more money or more time. I did neither. I spent the next 2 weeks studying the error obsessively. I ran every patient case individually. I isolated the variable that had corrupted the model. It was a data pre-processing error. The hospital system had a field they labeled previous liver conditions that was being interpreted differently by our system. Previous conditions that were resolved, that were historical, that were no longer clinically relevant, were being weighted as current risk factors. The error was in translation. It was in the gap between how humans understood medical history and how a statistical model interpreted it. I rewrote the pre-processing layer. But I didn't just fix it. I overfixed it. I built in redundancy and cross-validation that was theoretically excessive. And then I tested it against 10 years of archival data from 3 different hospital systems. I wanted to know not just that it worked, but how it worked, in what edge cases it might fail, and what I would need to know to prevent those failures. My family called during this period. My mother wanted to know when I would be home. My father had mentioned me to someone at his club. There was an impression I should be maintaining. Claire had gotten engaged to someone with the right last name and the right amount of liquid capital, and they were throwing a party. They needed me to be there, to be present, to be a supporting character in the family's ongoing narrative. I told them I was working on something important. They heard that I was being difficult. I didn't tell them I was rebuilding my entire diagnostic engine from the ground up. I didn't tell them that the hospital system was waiting to see if I could fix it. I didn't tell them that my reputation, and therefore the entire viability of the company, depended on the system working the second time. I didn't tell them anything, because anything I told them would have been met with skepticism and suggestions and the kind of well-meaning interference that was actually just control wearing a helpful expression. I told them I would try to make it to the party. I didn't go. The new system passed validation testing. Every edge case I'd thrown at it, every possible failure mode, every theoretical error. It passed all of them. The hospital system ran it again on their data. This time, the positive predictive value was 89%. True positives, real patients with real problems. The system had found them. The hospital wanted to expand the pilot. They wanted to integrate it into their actual clinical workflow. They wanted to start using it, and I still didn't tell my family. Silence is a specific kind of capital, and I had learned how to spend it carefully. For 18 months after the pilot's success, I operated in almost complete darkness regarding my family. I sent brief emails. I appeared at necessary functions and was forgettable in my appearance there. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask for help. I did not announce what I was building. What I actually did was take the system to market in the most unglamorous way possible. I approached hospital administrators, not venture capitalists. I created white papers, not pitch decks. I built partnerships with clinicians who understood the problem deeply, not investors who understood only the financial opportunity. I was careful because I had learned that careful was the only thing that worked when the world was structured to doubt you. By the time I was 23, we had signed 12 hospitals. By the time I was 24, we had signed 40. The system was being used to diagnose real patients. It was saving lives, in the way that early detection saves lives. It was doing exactly what I had designed it to do. And my family still believed I was a failure. I know this because I was there the night they decided it was time to help. I was in my apartment, which had gotten only slightly less terrible through the addition of a few things I actually liked. I was reviewing data integration protocols for the San Francisco expansion when my phone began to ring with the specific persistence that only came from my mother. The tone of the text messages that followed was orchestrated, not spontaneous. They had planned this. The dinner was the conclusion of the planning. What my family didn't know is that I had already closed the Series A round 3 weeks earlier. What they didn't know is that the lead investor was the same person who had rejected me in year 1, who had seen the newer version of the system and changed his assessment. What they didn't know is that I had legal paperwork sitting in my email, waiting for my signature, that would value the company at $38 million. The check they gave me at the country club dinner was $75,000. I had already decided how to use it, the moment I sat down at that table and saw my sister angling for the perfect angle. I would deposit it. I would deposit it in a separate account, clearly documented as a gift. I would attach records of the family dinner, the framing as a fresh start, the narrative of remedial help. I would create a paper trail that was so clear and so thorough that any attempt to claim it as investment rather than severance would collapse under scrutiny. Power, I had learned, came not from having more than someone else. It came from having documentation. The flight west was in first class, paid for by the same airline award points I'd accumulated from trips to pitch investors. I sat by the window and watched the landscape transform from the compressed density of the Northeast to the vast openness of Middle America. I didn't think much about the flight. I was thinking about timing. The press release was scheduled to go live on Monday. The Wall Street Journal had an exclusive. The angle was clean and compelling. A computational diagnostic system that had achieved 89% accuracy in early cancer detection, now expanding nationwide. founded by a 24-year-old MIT graduate named Emily Carter. There was a photo included, one I had carefully selected weeks ago, where I was standing in front of the San Francisco office. One of those photographs that conveyed capability without trying. It would hit the internet probably late Sunday evening. My family would see it the same time everyone else did. I had considered calling them beforehand, warning them. The courtesy of it had seemed appropriate for about 15 minutes, until I remembered that they had never extended courtesy to me in the form of honesty. They had been comfortable with the lie as long as the lie served them. I was simply ending the arrangement. The San Francisco office was in a building of glass and reflected sky, the kind of place that made you feel like you were literally touching the future. The team had grown to 38 people by the time I arrived. Engineers, clinicians, regulatory specialists, the kind of people who cared about the precision of the thing rather than the performance of it. We celebrated the funding quietly, in the way that people who are focused on something real celebrate, with recognition, not spectacle. There was work to do. There was always work to do. My phone started ringing on Monday at 6:47 a.m. It was my father. I didn't answer. He called back immediately. I let it go to voicemail. The message, when I listened to it 4 hours later, was a study in controlled panic. He had some concerns about the recent press. He wanted to clarify a few things before making any decisions. He was using the tone of someone who had not yet understood that they had no authority in this situation. He was speaking from the assumption that there was still a negotiation happening. There wasn't. By noon, my mother had texted. She was attempting softness, which meant she was attempting damage control. She had seen the article. She was so proud. She was wondering if perhaps they had misunderstood the situation at the dinner. She was asking if we could talk about this properly. The tone was, "We are still the architects of your life." The subtext was, "Please come home so we can regain control." Claire called at 2 p.m., which surprised me. She never called. She sent messages through other people, delegated conversations to her parents, maintained the illusion of closeness while never actually being close. But she called, and she left a voicemail that started with a word I'd never heard her use. Congratulations. Then she said she wanted to discuss partnership opportunities, because she had a friend who was raising venture capital. And wouldn't it be good for the family to be involved? She had recorded an unboxing video of a luxury watch and had gotten 1.2 million views last month. Her brand was growing. My success, recontextualized through her platform, could be beneficial for everyone. I didn't call her back. The legal email arrived on Wednesday. It was from a firm they used, a firm that specialized in complex financial matters. The language was precise and cold and concerned with the $75,000 check. They had concerns about the nature of the contribution and wanted to clarify the terms of partnership regarding my significant subsequent success. They were suggesting, with the kind of plausible deniability that lawyers specialize in, that the check had been investment rather than gift, that they were entitled to equity, that they were entitled to a seat at the table. I forwarded the email to my attorney, someone I had retained 9 months earlier, specifically for this contingency. She had a response drafted within 2 hours. The response detailed the timeline of events with mechanical precision. It included the text of the dinner invitation, framed as a fresh start. It included the check itself, which was described in my father's handwriting as seed money for a new beginning. It included the plane ticket, the clear presentation of exile framed as opportunity. It included documentation of when the company was founded, when the first prototype was developed, when the system began clinical testing. The check had come after none of this had happened. The check had come as a conclusion, not a beginning. The response stated clearly that the check would be treated as a gift and as severance, filed accordingly for tax purposes, and that any further legal action regarding the matter would be met with a counterclaim for bad faith settlement harassment. My attorney had one suggestion: actually deposit the check, make it official, put the transaction into the banking system where it became immutable documentation. I did this the following Monday, depositing it into an account that was then immediately transferred into a trust structure that my family could not touch. I took a screenshot of the deposit and emailed it to my attorney, along with a note. Documented. She replied with one word, perfect. The phone calls stopped after that. The emails continued for another week, each one slightly more desperate than the last. My father was now claiming that he had always believed in me. My mother suggested that perhaps we had misunderstood each other at the dinner and that they were ready to move forward together. Claire had stopped reaching out entirely, probably because her engagement had generated enough content for the month and she didn't need me anymore. I didn't respond to any of it. Months passed, and my family became a kind of archived story, one that existed in the past tense, written in a language I no longer needed to speak. The company grew. We expanded to 70 hospitals. We began working on integrating our system with electronic health records platforms. We hired a COO who had scaled 3 previous startups. We moved to a larger office with better lighting and views of the bay. These things happened, and they happened without my family's involvement or knowledge, in a way that would have been impossible if I had maintained the connection. I learned that my father had attempted to leverage our family name at his club, suggesting, according to someone who heard it third hand, that he had been instrumental in my success. I learned that my mother was telling people at her charity events that she had always encouraged my business interests. I learned that Claire had attempted to use my company's growth as a platform for her own ventures and had been politely declined. These stories reached me through the peculiar channels of technology world gossip, and I received them with the kind of detachment one feels toward news from a country one used to live in. The interesting thing about silence is that it becomes louder the longer you maintain it. Not in an audible sense, but in what it refuses. Every day I didn't call my mother was a day that proved I didn't need her. Every acquisition meeting I didn't attend with family present was a day that proved I could succeed without them. Every publication that featured my work without mentioning my family was a small act of erasure that felt like it was finally in my control. I hired a mentor during year 2, a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, who had founded a medical device company in the 1990s and had navigated the entire landscape that I was now navigating. She was 64, and wise in the way that comes from having lived long enough to know what actually matters. She didn't ask me about my family. She didn't need to. She recognized the architecture of someone who had learned to build alone. Patricia had a theory about women in technology. She said that our greatest strategic advantage was that men underestimated what we were capable of, because they were too busy looking at how we presented ourselves rather than what we actually did. She said the mistake that many women made was assuming this was a problem to be solved. She said the smarter women treated it as a tool. Let them think you're smaller than you are, she had told me, and you get to move in the spaces they're not watching. I thought about that often. On the 1-year anniversary of the press release, the company accepted an acquisition offer. It was larger than the Series A valuation had suggested, $185 million. It would have made my family very wealthy if they had actually invested in it. The amount was large enough that my mother called, for the first time in 8 months, to check in. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail about how she had always known I would do something special, how she was so proud of the woman I had become, how she would love to reconnect. I listened to the message once and then deleted it. I didn't save it. I didn't need to. I had moved beyond the point where I needed proof of anything. The acquisition closed quietly, as most acquisitions do. I stayed on as chief medical officer for the new company, a larger organization that needed what I knew and how I thought. The role was interesting in the way that roles are interesting when they are challenging and consequential. I moved to a better apartment in San Francisco, one with light and space and views. I bought the furniture slowly, deliberately, the kind of furniture that was mine and not borrowed from other people's lives. There was a moment, about 6 months after the acquisition, when I was in my office, the real office now, with my name on the door and a view that reminded me daily that I had made it out, when a junior engineer came to me with a problem. She was 22, sharp in the way that suggests she would be formidable if she could just stop doubting herself. She had an idea for improving the diagnostic protocol, but she was afraid to present it because the senior doctors might think it was too ambitious, or the investors might not understand it, or a dozen other metrics of external approval that had nothing to do with whether the idea was actually good. I spent an hour with her going through the data. The idea was solid. I told her so. And then I told her something else. I told her that the people who would doubt her regardless of whether her idea was good. That seeking their approval first was building her entire architecture on someone else's foundation. That the only power that couldn't be taken from her was the kind that came from being absolutely certain of something no one else was watching. She looked at me like I was speaking a language she was starting to learn. I told her to document everything. Every decision, every test, every failure and why it happened. Build a record so clear and so thorough that it couldn't be rewritten by someone else. And then, once you had that record, you could move however you wanted. You could let people believe whatever they needed to believe. You could be quiet and invisible in exactly the spaces where you needed to be invisible. And you could build something real in the silence. She presented the idea a week later. It was adopted. She got promoted 6 months after that. There is no resolution, really. There is only the continuation of a life that has moved beyond the people who tried to contain it. My family still exists somewhere in the geography of the world. My father still manages money for people who believe he can make them richer. My mother still sits on charity boards and performs generosity. Claire still builds her brand, though I gather her engagement ended when her fiancé discovered that his name was worth less than she claimed it to be. They are living the lives they were always going to live, which is to say, they are living the lives they designed around being observed by people who cared about such things. I think of them the way one thinks of a country one used to live in, with a kind of anthropological curiosity and a deep relief at having left. Last month I mentored someone else, a woman, mid-30s, who had left a corporate position because she was tired of being underestimated and over-explained to. She wanted to start something, but was afraid of the financial instability, the judgment, the family disapproval. I listened to her list her concerns with a patience that came from understanding every single thing she was afraid of. I told her that fear is data, not direction. That the people who were going to judge her would judge her regardless of success. That the only way to move forward was to move past the point where their judgment mattered at all. She started her company 3 months later. I'm watching it very carefully, and I think she is going to do something remarkable. This is the thing about silence. It teaches you to listen. And when you learn to listen properly, you start to recognize which voices actually matter and which voices are just noise, performing their importance in the spaces between moments that are real. Once you know the difference, you can't unhear it. You can't go back to treating performance as if it were substance. The San Francisco skyline on clear days is a particular blue-gray color, almost silverish. The light hits the water at the end of the bay and reflects upward. And for a moment, it looks like the city is floating on something made of sky. I stand in my office sometimes and look at that light, and I think about the country club dining room and the chandeliers and the arranged expressions of concern. I think about my sister positioning her phone to catch my capitulation. I think about my father sliding a check across a polished table, expecting gratitude. I think about the moment I accepted it all with a face that revealed nothing at all, and I feel no anger. I feel only the very quiet satisfaction of someone who had decided early on not to play the game that had been designed to diminish her. I had chosen to play a different game entirely, the game of precision, documentation, and the kind of power that comes from being right when no one is watching. The acquisition closed. The company thrives. The team I built has grown into something larger and more consequential than I could have built alone. The system we created is being used in hospitals across the country now, and it is preventing the kind of preventable deaths that my grandfather's death represented. None of this required my family's approval. None of this required their investment. None of this required them at all. And that is the most powerful thing I have ever built. Not the system, though that matters. Not the company, though that matters too. But the architecture of my own life, constructed so carefully and so precisely that it stands on its own. It stands on evidence. It stands on data. It stands on the collected documentation of every small decision I made when no one was looking. It stands on silence, and silence, I have learned, is the strongest foundation there is. The light on the bay is beautiful today. The city is floating again, suspended between water and sky. I have a meeting with the board in an hour. I have an email to send to that junior engineer about her new project. I have a life that is mine, and not borrowed from anyone else's narrative. This is what the quiet victory looks like. This is what you build when you stop trying to be seen and start focusing on being right.